When I was 7 years old, my world shattered into pieces. My mom, my everything, passed away suddenly. She was only 36, and I was too young to understand why she had to leave. I remember the hospital bed, the smell of antiseptic, and her pale hand squeezing mine one last time. The way she whispered, "Take care of yourself, sweetheart," has stayed with me ever since. That day, my life changed forever. My dad couldn't handle it. He packed his bags 2 weeks after the funeral, gave me a kiss on the forehead, and said, "You'll be better off with your grandparents." Then he left. Just like that. I stood by the window, clutching my stuffed bunny, watching his car disappear down the street. He didn't look back. I was sent to live with my grandparents, Elizabeth and Henry, in their small, creaky house on the outskirts of a quiet town. They were kind, but life wasn't easy. They lived on a fixed income. My grandpa's pension from his years working at the local factory and my grandma's small income from selling homemade jams and knitted scarves. We didn't have much, but they gave me everything they could. I didn't understand it then, but they sacrificed so much for me. My grandmother took on extra work, sewing dresses for the neighbors, while my grandfather started repairing old furniture for a little extra cash. They never complained. They just worked harder. School wasn't easy either. The kids would ask, "Where's your mom? Where's your dad?" I'd mumble something about living with my grandparents, and they'd look at me funny like I was some kind of charity case. I stopped talking about my family altogether. Grandma Elizabeth tried her best to fill the void. She was a short, round woman with a warm smile and calloused hands from years of knitting and cooking. She'd sit me on her lap and braid my hair, telling me stories about her own childhood, how she met Grandpa Henry, and how love was about sacrifice and patience. I held on to those stories like lifelines. Grandpa Henry was quieter. He was a tall, wiry man with a face carved by wrinkles and hands as strong as iron. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke louder than words. When I cried at night, missing my mom, he'd sit outside my room and hum softly until I fell asleep. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel safe. One day, when I was about 12, I stumbled upon an old box in the attic. It was tucked away under layers of dust and cobwebs, labeled Jessica's mom. Inside, I found photographs of my mom as a child, smiling with her arm around a man I didn't recognize. There were letters, too, written in neat cursive, addressed to someone named Mark. "Grandma," I asked that evening, "who's Mark?" Her face went pale. "Where did you hear that name?" I told her about the box. She sighed, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. "Mark was your mom's first love," she said. "They were engaged before she met your dad." I stared at her, confused. "What happened?" "They were young," she said. "Your mom wanted more from life, and Mark wasn't ready to settle down." She broke it off, but her voice trailed off. "But what?" Grandma hesitated. "There were rumors, sweetheart, that your mom never really got over him, and that your dad knew." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Was this why my dad left? Had he been haunted by a ghost from my mom's past? I couldn't shake the questions, but no one had answers. As I grew older, life with my grandparents became a mix of routine and quiet moments of joy. Grandma Elizabeth taught me to knit, and Grandpa Henry showed me how to sand down old wood to make it look new again. We had our little traditions, pancake Sundays, movie nights with an old VHS player, and evening walks around the neighborhood. But the weight of loss never fully left. My dad never called, never wrote, never showed up for birthdays or holidays. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I tried to convince myself I didn't care, but deep down, I wondered where he was and why I wasn't enough for him to stay. One day when I was 16, the phone rang. Grandma answered, and I watched as her face turned ashen. She handed the phone to me without a word. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. "Jessica, it's me." My dad's voice was hoarse, as if he'd been crying or drinking. I didn't know what to say. "Why are you calling?" "I want to see you," he said. I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right." My dad showed up 2 days later, standing on the porch with a bouquet of flowers and a guilty smile. He looked older, grayer, and tired. I didn't know whether to hug him or slam the door in his face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I was a coward. I ran when you needed me most." Grandma and Grandpa stood behind me, their faces unreadable. I invited him in, and we sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. He told me about his years away, how he'd moved from city to city, unable to settle down. He admitted to struggling with alcohol and depression after my mom died, and how he'd finally sought help. "I know I can't change the past," he said, "but I want to be part of your future." It wasn't an easy decision, but I agreed to give him a chance. Over time, we started to rebuild our relationship, piece by fragile piece. He attended my high school graduation, awkwardly cheering from the bleachers, and helped me move into my college dorm. Now, as I look back on those years, I realize how much my grandparents' love shaped me. They taught me resilience, kindness, and the value of family. My dad's return was a shock, but it forced me to confront the pain I'd buried for so long. Life is messy, complicated, and unpredictable. But it's also full of second chances. And for that, I'm grateful. When I was a kid, the one thing I always dreamed of was getting a good education. It wasn't just about the books or the grades. It was about proving to myself and to the world that I could make something of my life. My grandparents, Elizabeth and Henry, knew this and did everything they could to support me. They sacrificed so much, even when we barely had enough to make ends meet. I owe them everything. It wasn't easy. We didn't have money for fancy tutors or private lessons, so I studied late into the night with whatever books I could borrow from the library. My grandparents always encouraged me, even when things got tough. Grandpa Henry, who had worked at the factory his whole life, often came home exhausted, but he'd still find the energy to quiz me on my vocabulary words or check my math homework. Grandma Elizabeth would leave encouraging notes in my lunch bag, little scraps of paper that said, "You can do it, Jess," or "We believe in you." I kept every single one. But things started to change when Grandpa got sick. It began as a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. "It's just a cold," he'd say, brushing it off. But it wasn't. Soon he was too weak to work. Grandma had to take on extra shifts sewing and baking just to keep us afloat, and I took on part-time babysitting jobs after school to help out. The house grew quieter. The laughter that once filled it replaced by hushed conversations about bills and doctor's appointments. One night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Grandpa's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "We can't afford the medicine, Liz. We'll have to make do. We'll find a way," Grandma said firmly, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. "We always do." I couldn't sleep that night, the weight of their sacrifices pressing down on me. I promised myself that I would make it worth it. I would get into the best school, no matter what it took. My grades were good, but getting into a prestigious public school was still a long shot. The competition was fierce, and the application process was daunting. There were essays to write, interviews to prepare for, and endless forms to fill out. My English teacher, Mrs. Keller, became my biggest supporter. She was a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, but beneath her tough exterior was a heart of gold. "You've got the potential, Jessica," she said one afternoon after class. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She stayed after school to help me polish my essays and practice for the interviews. She even lent me her own copy of To Kill a Mockingbird to reference in one of my essays. "You remind me of Scout," she said with a rare smile. Fierce and determined. The day I received my acceptance letter was one of the happiest moments of my life. I came home to find Grandma and Grandpa sitting at the kitchen table, the letter already opened. Grandma was crying, and Grandpa was grinning from ear to ear despite his pale, gaunt face. "You did it, Jess," he said, pulling me into a hug. "We always knew you would." But the happiness was short-lived. A week later, Grandpa collapsed in the living room. I was the one who found him, sprawled on the floor, struggling to breathe. I screamed for Grandma, and we called an ambulance. The ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. I held his hand the whole way, begging him to stay with us. The doctors said it was pneumonia, made worse by his weakened immune system. He spent weeks in the hospital, and every day after school, I would sit by his bedside, reading to him from the same book Mrs. Keller had lent me. He'd listen quietly, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. "Don't let this stop you, Jess," he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you'll keep going." "I promise," I said, choking back tears. Grandpa passed away a few days later. The grief was overwhelming. Grandma and I clung to each other, finding solace in shared memories and the love he had left behind. I thought about giving up on school, on my dreams. It felt selfish to focus on my future when the present was so full of pain. But then I remembered the promise I had made to him. I threw myself into my studies with a renewed determination. My first day at the new school was both exhilarating and terrifying. The campus was enormous, filled with students who seemed so much more confident and polished than me. I felt like an outsider, a small-town girl in a sea of wealth and privilege. One of my classmates, a girl named Olivia, took an immediate interest in me. She was everything I wasn't: rich, glamorous, and effortlessly charming. At first, I thought she wanted to be friends, but it quickly became clear that she saw me as a target. She'd make snide comments about my clothes, my accent, the way I carried myself. "You're brave," she said one day with a fake smile, "coming here dressed like that." I tried to ignore her, focusing on my studies and the few friends I managed to make. There was Ethan, a shy boy with a passion for astronomy, and Mia, who shared my love of books. They became my lifeline, their kindness and humor helping me navigate the challenges of my new environment. But Olivia wasn't done with me. She spread rumors, made sure I was excluded from group projects, and even sabotaged my locker, filling it with garbage. One day, I found a note taped to my desk that said, "You don't belong here." I crumpled it up and shoved it into my bag, but the words stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone, not even Grandma. I didn't want to burden her with my problems when she was already dealing with so much. Instead, I poured my frustration into my studies, determined to prove Olivia wrong. The turning point came during a school debate competition. Olivia and I were on opposing teams, and the topic was the importance of education in overcoming adversity. I poured my heart into my argument, drawing from my own experiences and the sacrifices my grandparents had made for me. By the end, the auditorium was silent, the judges visibly moved. My team won, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of respect in Olivia's eyes. Things didn't change overnight, but that moment gave me the confidence to stand up for myself. I stopped letting Olivia's words get to me and started focusing on the people who truly mattered: my friends, my family, and the teachers who believed in me. As I look back on those years, I'm amazed at how much I overcame. The journey was far from easy, but every challenge made me stronger. My grandparents' love and sacrifices gave me the foundation to build a better future, and for that, I will always be grateful. When I was 15 years old, my life felt like it was held together by threads, and one by one, those threads began to snap. Grandpa Henry, the rock of our family, became seriously ill. It wasn't sudden, his health had been declining for years, but he always brushed it off. "It's just old age," he'd say, waving away our concerns with his rough, calloused hands. But when he started coughing up blood, there was no denying it anymore. We spent hours in the hospital, waiting for test results, hoping for good news that never came. The doctor, a serious-looking man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, called us into his office one afternoon. I'll never forget the way his face softened as he spoke. "It's advanced lung cancer," he said gently. "There's not much we can do at this stage." Grandma Elizabeth's face crumpled, and I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Grandpa tried to keep things light, cracking jokes about how he'd finally get some rest, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. He knew his time was running out, and so did we. The next few months were a blur of hospital visits, late-night phone calls, and whispered prayers. I watched as the man who had always seemed so strong and unshakable grew weaker by the day. He couldn't walk without help, and even simple tasks like eating became a struggle. But he never complained. Instead, he used what little strength he had left to remind me of the values he'd always lived by. "Take care of your grandma," he told me one night as I sat by his bedside. "And don't you ever give up, no matter how hard things get." When he passed away, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under us. The house, once filled with his laughter and the sound of his tools clinking in the garage, was suddenly quiet. Too quiet. Grandma and I leaned on each other, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. She'd lost the love of her life, her partner of over 40 years, and now she had to figure out how to keep our family afloat on her own. Grandma Elizabeth was nothing short of a force of nature. She took on every responsibility without hesitation, working 2, sometimes 3 jobs to make ends meet. She sewed dresses for the women in town, baked pies to sell at the farmer's market, and even cleaned houses for wealthier families. It didn't matter how tired she was, she kept going for me. One of her employers was a woman named Mrs. Whitmore, an elderly widow who lived in a sprawling mansion at the edge of town. Mrs. Whitmore was as cold and condescending as they came, constantly criticizing Grandma's work and paying her as little as possible. I hated seeing the way she treated Grandma, but we couldn't afford to lose the income. "Sometimes you have to swallow your pride for the people you love," Grandma told me when I begged her to quit. One evening, I decided to help Grandma deliver a batch of freshly baked pies to Mrs. Whitmore. When we arrived, I stayed in the car while Grandma went inside. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30. Finally, I got out to check what was taking so long. As I approached the house, I heard raised voices coming from inside. Peeking through the window, I saw Mrs. Whitmore waving a piece of paper in Grandma's face, shouting something about stolen money. My heart dropped. It turned out Mrs. Whitmore had accused Grandma of stealing a $20 bill from her kitchen counter. The accusation was baseless, but no amount of reasoning could change Mrs. Whitmore's mind. She fired Grandma on the spot and threatened to call the police if she ever stepped foot on her property again. Grandma walked out with her head held high, but I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. The loss of that job hit us hard. Bills started piling up, and for the first time, I saw real fear in Grandma's eyes. She tried to shield me from it, but I wasn't a child anymore. I knew things were bad. I started taking on more babysitting jobs and even cleaned a few houses myself, though I never told Grandma. I didn't want her to worry about me on top of everything else. Then came the night the power went out. I was sitting at the kitchen table, finishing up my homework by candlelight, when I heard a knock at the door. It was Mr. Thompson, our landlord, a balding man with a permanent scowl etched onto his face. He handed Grandma an eviction notice, saying we had until the end of the month to pay the rent or leave. After he left, Grandma sat down at the table, her hands trembling as she held the notice. "We'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to me. But I could see the cracks in her armor. For the first time, I wondered if we really would. In the weeks that followed, things went from bad to worse. One of Grandma's clients refused to pay her for weeks of work, claiming the dresses she'd sewn weren't up to standard. I came home one day to find her crying over a torn dress, the client's angry words still ringing in her ears. "I don't know how much more I can take," she admitted, her voice breaking. Despite everything, she never gave up. She reached out to old friends and neighbors, asking if anyone needed help with sewing, baking, or cleaning. Slowly, she managed to scrape together just enough to pay the rent and keep food on the table. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us going. Through it all, I found strength in her determination. I started volunteering at the local library, helping younger kids with their homework. It didn't pay, but it gave me a sense of purpose and reminded me why I was working so hard in school. I wanted to make her proud, to show her that all her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. One day, while I was at the library, a woman named Ms. Rivera approached me. She was the head of a local scholarship program and had heard about my academic achievements through one of my teachers. "We're always looking for students like you," she said, handing me a flyer. "You should apply." I couldn't believe it. The scholarship covered not only tuition but also living expenses, something that could change our lives completely. I ran home that evening, clutching the flyer like it was a golden ticket. Grandma hugged me tightly, her face lighting up for the first time in weeks. "This is your chance, Jess," she said. "Don't let it slip away." The application process was intense: essays, interviews, and a mountain of paperwork. But I poured my heart into it, knowing how much was at stake. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, Grandma and I cried together, holding each other in the middle of the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, it felt like things were finally starting to turn around. Looking back, I realize how much those years shaped me. They were some of the hardest times of my life, but they also taught me the true meaning of resilience and love. Grandma's strength and sacrifice showed me that no matter how difficult things get, there's always a way forward. And for that, I will always be grateful. When I turned 17, it became clear that my grandmother couldn't shoulder the burden alone anymore. After Grandpa Henry passed away, she had been working herself to the bone to keep us afloat, sewing, baking, cleaning houses, but no matter how hard she worked, the bills kept piling up. I couldn't stand watching her struggle like that. So I decided to get a full-time job at the local store, hoping it would ease some of the pressure. The store was called Bailey's General, a small family-owned business that had been in town for decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. I started as a cashier, working long shifts after school and on weekends. My boss, Mr. Bailey, was a gruff, middle-aged man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a voice like gravel. He didn't say much, but he was fair, and I respected that. His wife, Linda, handled the bookkeeping and occasionally helped out on the floor. She was kind, always slipping me an extra snack or a soda when she thought I looked tired. The job wasn't easy. The store was often busy, especially on weekends, and some customers could be downright nasty. I learned quickly how to plaster on a smile and bite my tongue, even when someone was yelling at me because we were out of their favorite brand of cereal. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was balancing it with everything else. Between school, homework, and my shifts at Bailey's, I barely had time to sleep. Some nights, I'd fall asleep at the kitchen table, my textbooks still open in front of me. Grandma tried to talk me out of it at first. "You should be focusing on school, not worrying about the bills," she said one night as we sat together in the living room. Her hands were shaking as she mended one of my old sweaters, the needle darting in and out of the fabric with practiced precision. "You're too young to have this kind of weight on your shoulders." "I'm not a kid anymore, Grandma," I told her. "I want to help. We're in this together, remember?" She didn't argue after that, but I could see the guilt in her eyes every time I came home exhausted from a long shift. I hated that she blamed herself, but there was nothing I could do to change her mind. All I could do was keep working and hope it would be enough. It wasn't long before I started making friends at the store. One of my coworkers, a girl named Carly, quickly became my closest ally. She was a year older than me, with bright red hair and a laugh that could light up a room. Carly had been working at Bailey's since she was 16, and she knew all the ins and outs of the place. She took me under her wing, showing me how to deal with difficult customers and how to restock shelves without throwing out my back. "Stick with me, kid," she said with a wink one afternoon as we rearranged the canned goods aisle. "I'll teach you everything you need to know about surviving this place." Carly was more than just a coworker. She became a friend. We'd spend our breaks together, sitting on overturned crates in the stockroom and sharing stories about our lives. She told me about her dream of moving to the city to study fashion design, and I told her about my plans to go to college someday, even though it felt like a distant dream. "You'll get there," she said, her voice full of conviction. "I know you will." But not everyone at the store was as kind as Carly. One of the other employees, a guy named Trevor, seemed to take pleasure in making my life miserable. Trevor was in his early 20s, with greasy hair and a permanent smirk that made my skin crawl. He was lazy, constantly shirking his duties and leaving the rest of us to pick up the slack. But what really set him apart was his attitude. He was rude, condescending, and downright cruel. One day, Trevor decided to target me. I was in the middle of stocking the shelves when he walked by and knocked over the entire display I'd just finished setting up. "Oops," he said, not even bothering to hide his grin. "Guess you'll have to start over." I clenched my fists, biting back the retort that was on the tip of my tongue. I didn't want to cause a scene, but it was getting harder and harder to stay quiet. Carly noticed my frustration and pulled me aside during our break. "Don't let him get to you," she said. "He's not worth it." I tried to follow her advice, but Trevor's antics only escalated. He started spreading rumors about me to the other employees, accusing me of stealing from the register and making mistakes on purpose to make him look bad. Mr. Bailey didn't believe him, but the tension at work became unbearable. I found myself dreading my shifts, my stomach tying itself in knots every time I walked through the door. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. The store was packed, and I was working the register, trying to keep up with the steady stream of customers. Trevor was supposed to be helping bag groceries, but instead, he was standing off to the side, scrolling through his phone. When I asked him to lend a hand, he snapped, "Why don't you mind your own business, Jessica? You're not my boss." Before I could respond, an older woman in the line spoke up. "Young man, she's working harder than anyone else in this store. The least you could do is help her out." Trevor's face turned red, and for a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. Instead, he stormed off, leaving me to finish the shift on my own. That night, Carly and I stayed late to clean up, and she finally convinced me to report Trevor to Mr. Bailey. "He's been getting away with this for too long," she said. "It's time someone stood up to him." The next day, I told Mr. Bailey everything. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked. "You're not the first person to complain about Trevor," he said with a sigh. "I'll take care of it." True to his word, Mr. Bailey fired Trevor that afternoon. The relief was immediate. I finally felt like I could breathe again. But the victory was bittersweet. I knew that no matter how hard I worked, the job at Bailey's would never be enough to solve all our problems. The bills kept coming, and no matter how many hours I put in, it felt like we were always one step away from losing everything. One night, as I was closing up the store, Carly approached me with a serious look on her face. "I've been thinking," she said. "You're working yourself to death here, and it's not fair. There's got to be another way." "What choice do I have?" I asked. "We need the money." Carly hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a flyer. It was for a job fair in the city, promising opportunities for young people looking to start their careers. "It's worth a shot," she said. "Maybe you'll find something better." I took the flyer, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to give up. Not on myself, and not on my grandmother. No matter how hard things got, we would keep supporting each other. Because that's what family does. I hadn't heard from my father in over 20 years when the phone call came. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the middle of folding laundry when my phone buzzed on the table. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me pick it up. "Jessica," a woman's voice said on the other end. She sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "This is Jessica." "Who's this?" "My name is Rebecca." I'm your father's wife." I froze. The name hit me like a brick. My father's wife? The man who had walked out of my life when I was 7 and never looked back? I didn't even know he had remarried. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. There was a pause, then she said, "I'm calling to let you know, your father passed away last week. He was in a car accident." I didn't know what to feel. Shock? Sadness? Anger? After all these years, I thought I was done with him, that he couldn't hurt me anymore. But now he was gone, and all the questions I'd carried for years would never be answered. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said stiffly, not knowing what else to say. "There's something else," Rebecca continued, her tone shifting. "I need to talk to you about his estate." That caught my attention. "What about it?" "Well, your father didn't leave a will," she explained, her voice growing more confident. "And as his wife, I'm entitled to most of his assets. But legally, you're entitled to a share as well. I was hoping you'd consider signing away your claim. It would make things much simpler for everyone involved." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After abandoning me and leaving me to grow up without a father, now he, or rather, his wife, wanted me to give up what little connection I had to him. "I'll have to think about it," I said, my voice tight. Rebecca sighed, clearly frustrated. "Jessica, this isn't about money. It's about what's fair. Your father and I built a life together. You weren't a part of that." Her words stung, but they also fueled something inside me. "I'll get back to you," I said before hanging up. The first thing I did was call Grandma Elizabeth. Even though she was in her 70s now, she was still sharp as ever, and I trusted her advice more than anyone else's. "She's trying to bully you," Grandma said after I explained the situation. "Don't let her. You have just as much right to that inheritance as she does, maybe even more." "I don't even know if I want it," I admitted. "I haven't spoken to him in years. It feels wrong." Grandma's voice softened. "I understand, sweetheart. But this isn't just about the money. It's about standing up for yourself. Don't let her push you around." I thought about her words all night, replaying Rebecca's call in my head. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to back down. If my father's estate had anything to offer me, whether it was money or answers, I was going to fight for it. The first step was hiring a lawyer. I didn't know the first thing about inheritance law, so I reached out to a friend from college who worked at a law firm. She referred me to a man named Eric Weiss, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for being tough but fair. Eric was in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. After listening to my story, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You have a strong case. Without a will, the law is clear. As your father's biological child, you're entitled to a share of his estate. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca launched an all-out campaign to get me to drop my claim. She called me repeatedly, leaving voicemails that swung between pleading and threatening. "Jessica, this is going to drag on for months," one message said. "Do you really want to go through all that? Just sign the papers and let it go." When that didn't work, she escalated. One day, I came home to find a letter in my mailbox. It was from Rebecca's lawyer, accusing me of being opportunistic and trying to exploit the situation for financial gain. I felt sick reading it, but Eric assured me it was just a tactic to intimidate me. "She's trying to rattle you," he said. "Don't let her." Things took an even darker turn when I started receiving anonymous emails. They were vague at first. Messages like, "You don't know what you're getting into and stay out of it," but then they became more personal. One email included a scanned photo of my father and Rebecca at their wedding, with a note that said, "This was his real family. You were just a mistake." I showed the emails to Eric, who advised me to file a police report. The police took it seriously, but there wasn't much they could do without knowing who was behind them. Still, the thought of someone digging into my life and trying to scare me off made my skin crawl. Around this time, I learned more about Rebecca's background. Through Eric's investigation, we discovered that she had been married twice before, both times to wealthy men who had mysteriously left her everything in their wills. The pattern was unsettling, to say the least. Eric suggested we bring this information to court, but I hesitated. I don't want to turn this into a witch hunt, I said. I just want what's fair. The court battle was grueling. Rebecca showed up to every hearing dressed to the nines, her demeanor icy and confident. She painted herself as the devoted widow, while subtly portraying me as the estranged daughter who didn't deserve a dime. But Eric was relentless. He presented evidence of my father's financial history, showing that he had continued to earn substantial income from investments and property, assets I was legally entitled to a share of. He also brought up Rebecca's previous marriages, hinting at a pattern of behavior that raised eyebrows in the courtroom. The turning point came when one of my father's former colleagues, a man named Tom Harris, agreed to testify on my behalf. Tom had known my father for years and revealed that my father had often spoken about wanting to reconnect with me but didn't know how. He regretted leaving Jessica, Tom said. He wanted to make things right. Hearing those words broke something inside me. For so long, I had believed that my father didn't care about me, that he had erased me from his life. But now, for the first time, I realized that maybe he hadn't. Maybe he just didn't know how to fix the mess he'd made. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. I was awarded a significant portion of my father's estate, enough to pay off my student loans and provide some financial security for Grandma and me. Rebecca was furious, but there was nothing she could do. The law was on my side. As I walked out of the courtroom that day, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a deep, aching sadness. The money didn't change the fact that my father was gone, or that we'd never had the chance to rebuild our relationship. But it did give me a sense of closure, a way to finally let go of the pain and resentment I had carried for so long. Looking back, I realized that the fight for my inheritance wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for myself, about proving that I mattered, even if my father hadn't always shown it. And for that, I'm proud. I never thought I'd be dragged into a courtroom battle over an inheritance from a man who had barely been in my life. When my father died, the last thing I expected was to be confronted by his wife, Rebecca, who seemed determined to convince me that I didn't deserve a penny of what he'd left behind. But after years of silence and abandonment, I wasn't about to let someone else decide what my father's legacy meant to me. This fight wasn't just about money. It was about standing up for myself and claiming the piece of my father's life that he had denied me for so long. It started a few weeks after I decided to pursue my share of the estate. Rebecca, my father's second wife, filed a claim challenging my right to the inheritance. According to her, my father had always intended to leave everything to her. He told me many times, she said during one of her endless phone calls, her voice syrupy with fake sympathy. He wanted you to move on with your life, Jessica. He didn't think you needed anything from him. Her words cut deep. I had spent so many years wondering what my father thought of me, if he even thought of me at all, and now she was claiming that he'd intentionally excluded me from his plans. It felt like she was trying to erase me from his life entirely. When I told my lawyer, Eric Weiss, about her claims, he wasn't surprised. This is a common tactic, he said, adjusting his glasses as he shuffled through paperwork in his office. She's trying to establish that you weren't close to your father, which could weaken your claim. Don't let it get to you. But it was hard not to let it get to me. Rebecca's attacks weren't just legal, they were personal. She sent letters and emails filled with veiled threats and passive-aggressive comments, all designed to make me feel like I was an intruder in my own father's story. You barely knew him, one email said. Why do you think you deserve anything? He built his life with me, not you. I forwarded every message to Eric, who assured me that Rebecca's tactics wouldn't hold up in court. The law is on your side, he reminded me. You're his biological daughter. Without a will, you're entitled to half of his estate, no matter what she says. Still, the process was draining. Rebecca's legal team filed motion after motion, each one designed to delay the proceedings and make things as difficult as possible for me. They questioned everything: my relationship with my father, my motivations, even my character. At one point, they tried to argue that I was only pursuing the inheritance out of greed, claiming that I didn't need the money and was only doing this to spite Rebecca. That's ridiculous, I said during one of my meetings with Eric. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this because it's my right. I know, Eric said. And the court will see that too. But Rebecca's team is banking on wearing you down. They think if they make this process hard enough, you'll give up. But I wasn't going to give up. Not after everything I'd been through. My father might not have been there for me, but I wasn't about to let Rebecca rewrite history and pretend I didn't exist. As the case dragged on, I started to learn more about Rebecca, and what I learned only strengthened my resolve. Eric had hired a private investigator, a man named Jack Coleman, to dig into her background. Jack was a former police officer with a gruff demeanor and a knack for uncovering secrets. He wasn't cheap, but he was worth every penny. What Jack found was shocking. Rebecca had a history of questionable financial dealings, including a lawsuit from her first husband's children, who accused her of manipulating their father into leaving her everything in his will. While the lawsuit had been settled out of court, the details painted a damning picture of a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to secure her place at the top. She has a pattern, Jack said during one of our meetings. She marries wealthy men, isolates them from their families, and then positions herself as the sole beneficiary. She's done this before, and she'll do it again. Hearing this made my blood boil. My father might not have been perfect, but he didn't deserve to be used like that. And neither did I. The courtroom battle was brutal. Rebecca showed up to every hearing dressed like she was attending a gala, her jewelry sparkling under the fluorescent lights of the courthouse. She carried herself with an air of superiority, as if the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Her lawyer, a slick-talking man named Victor Pierce, was just as arrogant. He spent hours trying to paint me as a distant, ungrateful daughter who had no right to my father's assets. But Eric wasn't about to let them win. He presented evidence of my father's financial records, which clearly showed that the majority of his wealth had been accumulated long before he married Rebecca. He also called witnesses who testified to my father's lingering guilt over abandoning me. One of the most powerful moments came when Tom Harris, my father's former colleague, took the stand. "I worked with John for over a decade," Tom said, his voice steady and clear. "He told me many times that he regretted losing touch with Jessica. He wanted to make amends but didn't know how. He loved her, even if he didn't always show it." Rebecca looked furious as Tom spoke, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the armrest of her chair. But there was nothing she could do to discredit his testimony. It was clear that my father hadn't intended to leave me out of his life, or his estate. The most dramatic moment came when Rebecca herself took the stand. Her lawyer asked her a series of carefully crafted questions, all designed to make her look like the grieving widow and me like the greedy interloper. But when it was Eric's turn to cross-examine her, things took a sharp turn. "Mrs. Collins," Eric began, his tone calm but firm. "Is it true that you were involved in a legal dispute with your first husband's children over his estate?" Rebecca's face paled. "That's irrelevant," she said quickly. "I think it's very relevant," Eric said, holding up a copy of the court documents. "These records show that you were accused of manipulating your first husband into cutting his children out of his will. Is that correct?" Rebecca stammered, her composed facade beginning to crack. "That case was settled. It has nothing to do with this." "But it does, Mrs. Collins," Eric pressed. "Because it establishes a pattern of behavior. A pattern that suggests you've made a habit of prioritizing your own financial gain over the rightful claims of others." By the time Rebecca stepped down, her confidence was shattered. And while her lawyer tried to recover, it was clear that the tide had turned in my favor. After months of arguments, evidence, and emotional testimonies, the judge finally made a ruling. I was awarded 50% of my father's estate, which included real estate, savings, and other assets. The other half went to Rebecca, who looked livid as the verdict was read. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming a part of my identity that had been taken from me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had stood up for myself and won. The inheritance couldn't fix the years of pain and abandonment, but it gave me something even more valuable, closure. And for that, I was grateful. The day the inheritance came through, I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in years. After months of fighting, stress, and doubt, it was over. The money wasn't just a victory. It was a lifeline, not just for me, but for Grandma Elizabeth too. For so long, she had carried the weight of our family on her shoulders, working herself to exhaustion to keep us afloat. Now, I could finally give her something she had never had, peace. The first thing I did was sit down with her in the living room of our little house. She was knitting a scarf, her fingers moving with practiced ease, but I could see the weariness in her eyes. Even though she'd always tried to hide it from me, I knew how much the years had taken out of her. "Grandma," I said, placing the checkbook on the table in front of us. "It's time for you to quit your job." She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Jessica? I can't just stop working. We still have bills to pay." "Not anymore," I said firmly. "We're paying off the mortgage, the utility bills, the credit card debt, everything. You've done more than enough for this family. It's time for you to rest." Tears filled her eyes, but she shook her head. "I don't know what I'd do with myself if I wasn't working." "You'll figure it out," I said with a smile. "Maybe you'll finally have time to knit something for yourself instead of everyone else." It took some convincing, but eventually she agreed. The next day, we sat down together and wrote out a list of every bill and debt that needed to be paid. Watching the balances disappear one by one was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. When it was all done, I called her employer, a wealthy woman named Mrs. Langley, who had been treating Grandma like a personal servant for years, and told her that Grandma wouldn't be coming back. "You'll regret this," Mrs. Langley snapped. "Do you know how hard it is to find reliable help these days?" "She's not your help anymore," I said before hanging up. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had taken control of something that had always felt out of reach. With Grandma's financial worries taken care of, I turned my attention to making her life as comfortable as possible. I used part of the inheritance to renovate our home, replacing the drafty windows and fixing the creaky floors that had plagued us for years. I even had a small ramp installed at the front door, knowing that Grandma's knees had been bothering her more and more lately. One afternoon, as the contractors worked on the house, Grandma and I sat outside on the porch, drinking iced tea and watching the world go by. She seemed lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted off her chest. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I never thought I'd live to see the day when I didn't have to worry about money." "I can't thank you enough for what you've done, Jessica." I reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to thank me. This is as much for you as it is for me. You've given me everything, Grandma. It's time I gave something back." She smiled, but then her expression grew serious. "What about you, Jess? What are you going to do now?" The question caught me off guard. For so long, my life had been about survival, working, studying, taking care of Grandma. I hadn't stopped to think about what I wanted, about what my future could look like. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent so much time worrying about everyone else. I'm not sure how to even begin thinking about myself. Well, she said with a twinkle in her eye, it's about time you figured it out. Over the next few weeks, I tried to focus on what I wanted. For the first time in years, I had the luxury of dreaming, of imagining a life beyond the day-to-day grind. But every time I tried to think about my future, I felt a pang of guilt. How could I focus on myself when Grandma was still here, still needing me? That's when I met Hannah. Hannah was the director of a local community center, and we crossed paths when I volunteered to help with a fundraiser. She was in her early 30s, with an energy and enthusiasm that was contagious. From the moment I met her, I was struck by how passionate she was about her work. You have a knack for this, she said one afternoon as we organized raffle tickets for the fundraiser. Have you ever thought about working in community outreach? Not really, I admitted. Most of my experience is in retail and caregiving. That's exactly why you'd be great at it, she said. You understand people. You know what it means to help someone in need. We could use someone like you at the center. The idea intrigued me, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to take such a big step. Still, Hannah's encouragement stuck with me, and I started to think about what it would mean to build a career helping others. While I was figuring out my next move, life threw another curveball. One evening, as I was sorting through some of my father's old belongings that Rebecca had reluctantly sent over after the court case, I found a stack of letters hidden at the bottom of a box. They were addressed to me, but they had never been sent. The letters were dated years ago, starting from when I was a teenager. In them, my father wrote about his regrets, his mistakes, and his hopes for reconnecting with me. I don't know how to face you, Jess, one letter said. I don't know how to apologize for everything I've done, but I want you to know that I think about you every day. I'm proud of you, even if I don't say it. Reading those words was like a punch to the gut. For so long, I had believed that my father didn't care about me, that he had written me off and moved on with his life. But now, I realized that he had been just as scared and unsure as I was. He had wanted to reach out, but he didn't know how. I showed the letters to Grandma, who hugged me tightly as I cried. He was flawed, she said gently. But he loved you, Jess. Don't ever doubt that. The discovery of the letters gave me a new sense of closure. I didn't need his approval anymore, but knowing that he had cared about me in his own way helped me let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying for years. With the house finally renovated and Grandma living comfortably, I decided it was time to take Hannah up on her offer. I started working part-time at the community center, helping organize events and connect people with resources. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Hannah became a mentor to me, guiding me through the ups and downs of the job. She introduced me to new people and encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone. One of those people was Marcus, a social worker who ran the center's after-school program. Marcus was kind, patient, and deeply committed to helping kids in need. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared passion for making a difference. As the months went on, I found myself growing into my new role. I wasn't just Jessica, the girl who had spent her life taking care of others. I was Jessica, a woman with dreams, ambitions, and a purpose of her own. And for the first time, I felt like I was truly living. Grandma, of course, was my biggest cheerleader. She attended every event I organized, beaming with pride as she watched me take charge. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, she said one evening as we sat together on the porch. And so am I. Her words meant everything to me. After all, everything I had accomplished was because of the sacrifices she and Grandpa had made for me. They had given me the foundation to build a better life, and now I was finally making the most of it. Looking back, I realized that the inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about freedom. It gave me the chance to take care of the person who had always taken care of me, and it gave me the space to figure out who I was and what I wanted. For the first time in my life, the future felt wide open, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me.